I just recently picked up the Nintendo Switch 2 about a couple days ago or so, and I've been steadily testing it and playing through a bunch of different games, as well as just exploring some games that I'm genuinely enjoying with this new Nintendo console. However, one of the first accessories that I picked up with it was the Nintendo Switch Pro controller for the Switch 2. And this controller has some pretty interesting improvements over the previous Nintendo Switch Pro controller, as well as some new adjustments and new features to it that make it a really strong core controller for your Nintendo Switch console. So in this video, I'm going to go over some of the things that I really like about it, and also some of the things that I think Nintendo could have improved upon with this controller. So let's take a look. So to start, the Pro controller for the Switch 2 retails for over $100 Canadian, which, just to kind of give you a bit of context, that's pretty expensive compared to most other gaming companies. Like if you look at a standard Xbox controller, you're like $69.99 Canadian. I believe the PlayStation 5 controllers are $79 or $89.99 Canadian. So over $100 is a relatively high price for I'm going to call this a standard controller because it doesn't have the same level of customization as most higher end Pro controllers that you can get, like the Elite Series 2 controller or some of the ones that are even more expensive than that. We'll get into that in a moment. But really with the Nintendo Switch 2, you only really have two options. You either, official options I mean. So you really only have more Joy-Cons, or you can go with the Pro controller for the Switch 2, which is a bit more expensive. So just something I thought I'd highlight. Now, as far as packaging goes, all the setup stuff is on the back of the box here. And taking it out of the box, it's pretty minimalist. You get a USB-C charging cord as well as the controller itself. Now, getting into the setup, this was incredibly simple. All I did was put my USB-C wire into the Switch 2 and it immediately recognized it and accepted it out of the gate. So very simple, and I'm going to go into this a bit deeper with my Switch 2, but I like that the charging ports now are on the side. So overall, just very simple setup. Now, into getting, one of the first features that I did want to try out was the mapping of the back buttons. I've used third-party options on the original Switch that have mappable back buttons, and most of them you hold down. Usually it's like the mute button, like on the PDP controllers, and then it flickers, and then you can map those buttons on the back buttons. But in this case, Nintendo actually has it built into every single game. It's almost like each game can get its own unique profile, where you can essentially hold down the home button and you can map each of those left and right bumper buttons to whatever you want. Now, one of the things that I'm going to highlight out of the gate here that I noticed immediately upon testing this controller is this controller, the joysticks feel very smooth and in a really good way. I immediately tried Mario Kart and played that for quite some time, and the joysticks on this just feel so good. They feel so smooth, and I will say feel a lot smoother than the already improved Joy-Cons that are on the Switch 2. And those are, in my opinion, they feel good already, but this feels even better. And there's also a nice build quality and weight to this controller that's kind of mixed into that just makes this feel like a really solid controller. Now, I wanted to test those joysticks on more than just like a racing game like Mario Kart. I don't have any of the exclusive, or not exclusive, sorry, but any of the Switch 2 shooters like Cyberpunk or Hitman. So I tested some of the games from the original Switch, like Call of Juarez Gunslinger, which I played a ton of and beat multiple times at this point. And I would argue that these joysticks, they feel very good, and for aiming, they feel a lot smoother and a lot better than the Joy-Con joystick does. And what I mean by that is the Joy-Con, even on the original Switch, felt always a little like the dead zone was too stiff, so you felt like you were almost struggling to aim smoothly in some cases, which worked for some games, but not so well for others. Whereas this controller on Call of Juarez, even aiming in Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, it just felt really tight and really good and really smooth overall. So that's one of the most immediate things that I always test with any of these controllers. I always, whether it's the Xbox, whether it's the Switch, doesn't matter. I always like to test the dead zones and the joysticks, but I'm gonna argue that these feel exceptional. They feel incredibly good. And I would say they're on par with my Elite Series 2 controller, which I hold in very high regard. So overall, they're very good. Now, as well as the buttons feel solid. They have the perfect level of rigidity that you'd want, but they also feel smooth without feeling like they're too squishy. The actual triggers and everything else, they feel good. Now you have to understand, I'm used to the PlayStation and the Xbox having the tactile triggers that are pressure sensitive, so I'm still always a little thrown off with Nintendo's consoles due to the fact that they don't really have that on the Switch and the Switch 2 with any of their controllers. But overall, they feel good. The D-pad as well, for the few games that I tested it on, feels generally good. You also have a couple new additions to this controller, as well, of course, as those back buttons. You also have the chat function added, which I haven't played with a whole lot on the Switch 2, but you have the chat function built into the actual controller, so you just click that and chat starts up pretty much immediately if you have it set up. It works overall well. They've also added to this controller a headphone jack, which I've not tested. However, I understand that it's probably going to work very similar to any of the third-party controllers that I've had that have a headphone jack. But it's nice to have that if you are using a game with a headset and you're sitting on a couch and you don't want to play with the speakers, or you want to just voice chat and have a gaming headset on and use that. So that's built into the controller as well, which is cool. Now, some things that you may want to consider with this controller. And the first thing that kind of stands out to me, for me, my hands aren't overly big, so this isn't a major issue, but compared to like an Xbox controller, which I feel like is the perfect size, this is definitely, as far as the grips go, just a little smaller. And I understand the Switch is trying to kind of tailor itself towards all sorts of demographics, kids included, but this is supposed to be like a pro level controller, so I feel like kids are kind of taken out of the equation here. And the controller itself just seems a little smaller in terms of the grips versus your Xbox Series controllers or PlayStation controllers. I myself, I've got used to it pretty quick after using this for around, let's say, 20 hours or so. Feels pretty good. But as far as some people who might like the weighting of, or the sizing of like a Xbox Elite controller, or even just a general Xbox controller or a PS5 controller, this is definitely going to feel just a bit smaller. And that is something to consider. Now, as far as the actual tactile feeling of holding it and the grip of it, it feels good. But it just does feel a little smaller than what you may be used to on like your Xbox Series type console. Now, speaking of my playtime, I do want to highlight the battery life. The battery life on this is, from what I can tell, about equivalent to the original Pro controller. And again, I've only put 20 hours or so into this on a full charge, but putting the charge in, using the controller so far after it's been charged, I've been about 20 hours in and I'm about halfway. So at this point, the controller, I'm gonna wager, is gonna go about 40 hours, very similar to the previous Pro controller. There's nothing that's really changed there. Another thing I want to highlight is rumble in this controller feels about the same as it did on the previous Pro controller, which I never had a problem with, something I want to highlight. There's also the same motion capabilities as your Joy-Cons baked into this controller as well. So if you have a game that uses motion aiming like Zelda or Call of Juarez Gunslinger, that works perfectly fine. I myself am not personally a fan of that, but it's there if you want it. Overall, my biggest gripe about this controller does come down to pricing. I'm gonna highlight that it's a good controller. It's a very well-built, solid controller. However, for the 100+ price tag, it seems a bit steep considering that, yes, all you're really getting are 2 back bumper additions on this, as well as a headphone jack. And yeah, the chat's gonna probably be a standard default for anything Nintendo, so you get that as well. But for the price point, and just sort of clear, I thought the previous Pro controllers were also quite expensive, but again, we're well over $100 for this controller, and we don't get things like interchangeable joysticks for a Pro level controller, or tightening of the joysticks themselves to make them tighter or looser depending on what you're doing with them. And that to me is something that It's not a major gripe, but when you consider the price point, to me, this is on par with like a good standard Xbox controller, not on par with an elite level controller. And I know some people may take problem with me saying that, but when you're well over $100 for a controller that works well and it does everything it's supposed to do very well for Switch 2 base games, it would be nice to see something that was a bit more substantial for that price point. Like I said, like interchangeable joysticks or even options to tightening up those joysticks. Things like that to me would add a bit more depth to this price point and make this to me seem like it's giving you a lot more bang for your buck. The downside to this though is you're kind of, if you want an official option from Nintendo, this really is your only other option versus the Joy-Cons. And in my opinion, this should be the standard offering, and it would be nice to see something a bit above that, kind of like the Elite Series 2. But at this point, my main gripe really does come down to the price point and the sizing. With that being said, this is still a very, very good controller, and if you're willing to spend that over $100, you're not gonna go wrong with this controller if you want something that's just gonna be durable, it's going to last, and just generally work very well. But if you want an actual pro-level controller, you most likely are gonna have to consider some of the third-party offerings that are on the original Switch or that are gonna be coming to the Switch 2.